Morning, everyone. We're up to Perek Vav, Mishna Daled. Okay. Hagainev Truma v'lo yachala. Person steals Truma and he did not eat it. Mishalem Tashlume Kefel Demei Truma. He pays a double payment of the value of the Truma. The Torah tells us that if you steal something from someone, you have to return the principal, whether it's the actual article in its original form, or if that original article is not present anymore, you have to pay money. And you also are fined a second payment of the principal. That's called kefil, double. You pay double the principal. Now, in this case, he stole truma. It belonged to a Kohen. But if we're talking about a case where the truma went to a specific Kohen, so now it's the Kohen's property, and you steal it from him, you didn't need it. So you're going to pay kefil, you're going to pay double. Double what? Double the value of what you stole, which is truma. And as you mentioned many times before, truma, the value of truma is much less than regular grain because truma is very limited by the people who consume it, and even those who do consume it, who are the Kohanim, are limited in how they can consume it. Okay, so that's the first case. You steal truma, you got to pay double the value of the truma. Achala, now let's say after he stole it, he ate it without realizing it was truma. Mishalem shnei kronim v'chaymesh. He will have to pay two principals, the amount of two principals, and a fifth. Karen v'chomesh menachulin, a principal and a fifth from grain that is chulin, that all the maestras, everything has been taken off from it. The Karen demei truma, and the principle of the value of the truma. So let's analyze this. Okay, this person stole. Besides for stealing, he ate truma accidentally. And as we have been learning, when you eat truma accidentally, the Torah obligates a person to replace what you ate. You compensate what you ate, but you have to compensate it by replacing the truma with grain that is chulin, grain that is completely edible. Everything has been separated from it to allow you to eat it. And that grain, that chulin, will now turn into truma to compensate the principal that was eaten. Plus, you can also have to add grain to make a fifth, to add the fifth that the Torah basically fines you. When you eat truma accidentally, you're also fined a chomesh, a fifth, that you have to add to it. So in this case, what the Mishnah says is you're going to pay one principal and a fifth for the fact that you ate truma unintentionally, and that has to come in achul, and that's to come from grain that is chulin. That's where the karen and the chomesh, that's where one karen and chomesh are going to be taken care of. The karen demei truma, you also have to pay another principal value of the truma because you stole. So that's what the Mishnah means when it says you pay for two kronim, you have to pay for two principals and a fifth. There's one principal that is going to be coming from chulin because it is the replacement for the truma. There's going to be another karen, another principal payment, which is really the double for stealing. I should mention that before. You have here two things. He stole and he ate truma. Now, when you give chulin to replace the truma that was eaten, that's going to come from the point of the stealing and from the point of the eating. But from the point of the stealing, there's a double principle. There's a double payment. So that's the Mishnah says one karen and chomesh and the fifth come from the chulin, come from the grain, and then another karen, which is really another principal payment, which is the payment of kefil, of the double payment for stealing, the made truma, that comes for the value of truma. You pay it according to the value of truma, and it can come from any money. It doesn't have to come from grain. This is a payment for stealing, and that can be done with, again, and the original thing you stole truma is not here because you ate it. So now you'll pay money for the value of the truma that was stolen. Okay. Gonav, so that is that's the first case of the Mishnah. Okay, next case. Gonav, Trumas, Hektish, Va'achala. Now here, the case is like this. The Kohen had his Truma. and he sanctified it to the Beis HaMikdash. He gave it to what's called Bedek HaBayis. He gave it towards the upkeep of the Beis HaMikdash. That means that this Truma was only permissible to Kohanim, now becomes the property of the Beis HaMikdash. As now being the property of the Beis HaMikdash, the Kohen can't eat it because you're not allowed to have personal benefit from something that belongs to the Beis HaMikdash. Something that's been consecrated to Hektish, which is the word for the Beis HaMikdash. You can't have any personal benefit from it. Typically, what's going to be done with this Hektish, what you sanctify, what you consecrated, is the Beis HaMikdash is going to sell it, and the money will then belong and be used by the Beis HaMikdash for whatever it needs. So here what happened was, it was Truma. The Kohen had Truma. He sanctified it to the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, that was what happened. Now somebody else came, stole it, and ate it. So he stole something that belonged, that was Truma and Hektish, and then he ate it. Now, it's important to know that the same way that if you accidentally eat Truma, the Torah obligates you to pay or to compensate the principal value plus a fifth, the same thing happens with Hektish. With Hektish, you also have to pay back the principal to Hektish and the fifth. Now, again, it's not the same idea. You don't take chulin and becomes Hektish. It's a payment to Hektish. But the point is that in both cases, we really have here a payment of Keren and Chumash for both things that you did. So Mishna says, V'shalem shnei chamashim v'keren. You pay 2/5 and 1 Keren. She'ein behektish tashlumei kefil, because when it comes to stealing from Hektish, there's no payment of double. There's no double payment. That's derived from the Torah. It's derived from the words of the Torah. When the Torah obligates a thief to pay kefil, to pay double, then it's only when stealing from another person, not stealing from Hektish. So when you steal from Hektish, there's no kefil. The fact that you stole the Truma and the Hektish, right, and you ate it, now you have to deal with the fact that you ate Truma. I know it belonged to Hektish, but you still ate Truma. And you ate Hektish. So you have to deal with paying back principal and a fifth. Now, when it comes to paying back principal is a compensation. That's what it is. Even if we're talking about Truma, where there's a very specific way of how to compensate for the principal, it's still a compensation. So there's not going to be 2 principal payments here, both for the fact that it was Truma and it was Hektish. You only pay 1 principal for one thing. It's one thing, it's 1 principal. Okay, just that. Being that we're talking about that you ate Truma, so you have to follow the Torah's directives for eating Truma, which means when you make up the principal, you got to make it up with chulin, with grain that is chulin, that is completely edible. Everything's been separated from it. You're going to set that aside as the Truma, and it's going to become Truma. So when the Mishnah says you pay 2/5 and a Keren, that principle is going to have to be a principle from chulin, because you've got to deal with the Truma aspect of it, and it's a compensation of the principle. It'll take care of compensating for eating Hektish too. The fifth, that's a fine. That's what we call a knas. That's, so to speak, a fine that the Torah gave you. Call it a fine, call it atonement, but it's not a compensation. It's something that the Torah mandated that you have to add to your payment to the principal. Now, in this case, there's a fifth from the point that it was Hektish, belonged to the Beis HaMikdash. There's a fifth from the fact that it was Truma. Those are 2 separate sins. It's not a compensation. It's basically, we'll call it a fine of sorts for either eating Truma or eating Hektish. So you did both things, right? You transgressed both things. You have to pay a Chumash for both. And 1 Chumash will be from chulin, because it's the Chumash for eating Truma, and the other fifth can just be money, the value of the Truma. But there's not going to be 2 principal payments, because since you stole from Hektish, there's no kefil, there's no double payment. So whatever way you pay the Keren, you've compensated for the Keren, that's done, and that covers both. But because you also went ahead and you did both, transgressed both, you ate from Hektish and you ate from Truma, you have to pay 2/5. Now, there's a very interesting question. We mentioned before we had it, the Mishnah mentioned that in a situation where you ate, let's say truma, it was truma that belonged to someone, you ate it accidentally. So we say that the Karen goes to that Kohen who you ate from. The Chomesh, you want any Kohen you want. Okay. Now in our case, where you ate truma that was hektish, the Mishnah says 1 principal and 2/5. Okay, 1 principal and 2/5. Now if you think about the fifths, right? So 1 is for hektish, eating hektish. 1 is for eating truma. So 1/5 is going to go to hektish. The other 5th is going to go to a Kohen, because that's what you're paying that 5th for. The question is the principle, this Karen, this principle, right? That you now have to compensate, right? You took chulin, you set it aside to pay for the Karen of truma, for the principle of truma that you ate. You have chulin, you set it aside, it becomes truma. Who's it go to? Who's it go to? Does it go to hektish? Go to the Kohen? And the answer is, according to some commentaries, that you give it to hektish because it belonged to hektish. The Kohen gave it to hektish. It belonged to hektish. So once it belongs to hektish, where is the principle going to go to? It's going to go to hektish. True, it's a principle that is replacing truma for eating truma, but you give that principle back to the owner. In a case where it was never given to any Kohen, you can go to any Kohen. In a case where it went to a specific Kohen, it goes to a specific Kohen. But here, when you ate it, it belonged to hektish. So the truma belonged to hektish. If the truma belonged to hektish, belonged to the Beis HaMikdash, that principle will now go to the Beis HaMikdash. And it's going to deal with it like before. This is now truma that belongs to hektish. Hektish will sell it to a Kohen, and the money will now belong to hektish. So that's what happens in this case, where you stole the truma that had been consecrated to the Beis HaMikdash. The Mishnah says you pay 2/5 and 1 principal. Okay. Mitzvahs lo yisaseh shlikach kohen isha zona. Prohibition against the Kohen marrying a woman who is called a zona, a woman who has strayed, so to speak. We have to see what that means. Doesn't mean as broad as it sounds. But we know a Kohen has certain women he's not allowed to marry because he's a Kohen. And one of those women are a woman who has the status of a zona. Shenema, as the pasuk says, Isha zona lo yikachu. A woman who is a zona, they shall not marry. Okay, zona amura b'Torah. The zona mentioned here in the Torah means kol she'eina bas Yisrael. Either she is not a Jewish woman. Okay, so if he marries her, Kohen marries her, he has transgressed the prohibition of zona. Or bas Yisrael shenivel adam she'asur li naselai. However, she was intimate with a man that she is forbidden to marry. So if, for instance, a woman is not allowed to marry a mamzer, as we mentioned yesterday, and let's say she was intimate with a mamzer, she now attains the status of a zona. She did an act of intimacy that she was forbidden to do. That now gives her the status of a zona. Or let's say she was intimate with a chalal. What's a chalal? Is the child that comes from a Kohen who married a woman who was not allowed to marry. So let's say a Kohen marries a divorcee, and they have a child. They have a boy. This boy, his father's a Kohen, but he's not a Kohen. He's called a chalal. He's basically been desecrated from the kahuna because he was born from a marriage that a Kohen was not allowed to have. Now, there's nothing wrong with marrying a chalal. There's nothing wrong. But if she does marry a chalal, she does get the status of a zona. She has had a act of intimacy with someone that has defiled her from the kahuna. There's nothing wrong with marrying this chalal, but the mere fact that she was intimate with a chalal does not allow her anymore to marry a Kohen. Even if, let's say, she was intimate, she was basically raped, or it was an unnatural union, she gets the status of a zona. But if, let's say, a person was intimate with a single woman. Even though she is a Kadesha, which we discussed before, which means that she had abandoned herself to all for the purposes of immorality, or let's say someone was intimate with a woman who was a nida, she became impure or forbidden for intimacy because she had menstruated and didn't go to the mikveh. Let's say a woman does an act of intimacy with an animal. That does not make her a zona. So just by having relations, even though she may have been practicing prostitution, and again, in a way that she didn't do that with someone who was a person she's not allowed to do it with, or any of the people mentioned before. It's regular, a person who didn't have any kind of problem marrying her, but didn't marry her, was just immoral with her. Or a person, so that woman, she's not a zona, she can marry a Kohen. A woman who had intimacy when she was a nida, she can marry a Kohen. A woman who had practiced bestiality is not forbidden to a Kohen. So it's only those ones mentioned before that we say becomes a zona. In the case of, again, a non-Jewish woman, or a woman who was intimate to marry, or she was intimate with a halal, a person born from a marriage that a comes out to have. All these cases, she gets the status of a zona, and she may not marry a Kohen. Have a wonderful day.